So we're going through a series in the book of Jonah. It's well worth a look, and we're coming to the end of that series. And if you're familiar with the story of Jonah, you might well say to yourself, well, we know how this story ends. The fish spits him out, Nineveh is saved, Jonah lives happily ever after, God loves a trier. We might think that that's the storyline. It's not quite. Did you consume the reading at the end? Did you hear what was described? Jonah goes to the edge of town to see if the people change. God relents. It's a weird ending. The tree that Jonah is sitting under withers. He gets sunburn, and he gets pretty hacked off about the sunburn. We get a bit hacked off about sunburn, but it's still a weird ending to a story. And then the people change and are saved, and Jonah goes into a chronic depression. I mean, man, he is just ready to die. He's suicidal. He's at the end of himself. If you can imagine the nature of the story. There's a new Moana film coming out. Anybody like Moana? You don't have to shout. Yes, Mitch, straight up with Moana because he's got songs and you can dance, Mitch. That's right, isn't it? Moana movie coming out, all that seafaring adventure. Yet at the end of it, if you could imagine that Moana had a mental health crisis, can you imagine it ended off like that with a crying going off on a boat? That would be a great film to take the kids to, wouldn't it? You'd all be rushing along to see that. It's kind of got that feel. It's a bit like Castaway. Not the rude one, the one with Tom Hanks in it, where after the heroics and the sea and the salvation, remember how it ends? He's heartbroken, and he's at a crossroads in his life again. This is not a kid's story. It's not just an uplifting, genteel tale. There's a heaviness about it, and there's questions. It leaves you, if you properly read it, it leaves you with questions about God and whether he's good and whether you're following him or not. One of the questions that you could start off with would be, why on earth is he so sad? Why is he so sad? He's had a miracle escape. He's had incredible success. And he's back on God's side. What's made him so sad? The answer, and if we can get the text up, is in verse 1. See what he says there in verse 1? It seemed very wrong. Jonah's issue was justice. He looked at what was going on in Nineveh. He saw that God was going to let him off with it. And the injustice of it was just too much for him. We have got, in our human nature, strong sense of what justice is. Occasionally, we have a tots group on a Monday, and I walk in, and it's wonderful. I see one kid nick another kid's toy, and a very peaceful place goes into absolute meltdown. It's chaos straight away. Why? Because all these little tots, these wonderful, gorgeous, cute little tots, have got a strong sense. You're not going to nick me. You're going to nick my toy. Who the heck do you think you are nicking my toy? And it's wonderful. They just scream injustice. I wish we could do that. In a sense, we can. They just scream. He's nicked my toy, but there's no actual words. It's just a big scream. I was on jury duty a couple of weeks ago, and in that crowd, there was all different types of people. 3 of them were really quiet. So I'm one of these people. I'm a people watcher. I'm an introvert. I sort of soak up everything. I see where I sit inside these 12 different people, and 3 of them were really quiet. They stayed really quiet all week while we consumed all this evidence when we sat there and had lunch. Didn't get a peep out of them. And then we started to deliberate. They were really genteel and kind and quiet and shy. Then we deliberated. Then somebody said, I think they're not guilty. When we got onto guilt, these 4 quiet people strengthened up. They had some inner resolve, and no person was going to put them off getting their point across. We have a strong sense of justice. And Jonah, you see the start of the text, he knew that God was going to be forgiving. This is what he says. And then he goes into what is a really quite weird, I don't know what your prayers are like, but this is a really weird prayer rant. He uses what is very familiar language in the Bible, and he kind of throws it back at God. This is what I said. You start a prayer like that. This is what I said. This is what I've been talking about, God. I don't know if you ever started a prayer like that. It's quite funny, I think. I know you're gracious. He's annoyed. If you ever get annoyed with somebody who's just really good. Sometimes our rants are not just at the bad stuff, either. You got somebody in your life who's actually a bit of a good person, like chirpily, awkwardly, optimistic all the time. Sometimes you want to rant about them. This is what's happening in this moment. This is what I said. I knew you were gracious. I knew you were compassionate. I knew you were slow to anger. He's cross with that about God and abounding in love. And we get like that. Sometimes we rant because people are good. And I don't know if you've ever had this, but as you're ranting about the person that is good, in the back of your mind, you have this moment where you think, I wonder if this might be a me problem. You ever had that? You're ranting about the good person, you're thinking, maybe this is me. This person's actually good, and I'm getting really hacked off, and I'm griping about them. One of the things I want to remind you of is that Jonah, one of the suggestions that I've made as we've read through Jonah, is it's a satirical episode of God's Word. And we see his flawed response to great kindness. What's supposed to happen is we become increasingly aware of our own difficult responses to God's kindness. We ache for justice. The truth of it is, I want you to think about this for a second, especially if you're a Christian. Observe it, consider it if you're not a Christian, but especially if you're a Christian, think about this. The truth is, to follow God's lead, to actually listen to what he says about forgiveness, is really, really, really hard. Do you know what Jesus says? Forgive people over and over again. I actually tried to do that. I actually thought about what that would be like. That would take you to where Jonah's at. See the picture of Jonah? He's got his head in his hands. Make you want to die, make you want to give up if you keep giving out in that way. Love your enemy. You ever tried to do that? Ever tried to really do that? Love your enemy. To keep having your kindness, your goodness stretched out. This is kind of the picture that's been drawn out before us. On people, like the people in Nineveh, the baddies who just don't deserve it. Have you ever found yourself feeling that? Your kindness just keeps going out, and it keeps going out, and it keeps going out, and it keeps disappearing into people who aren't very good with it. If you've not felt that ache and want to give up yet in your life, if you've not gotten to that point, I would say it's probably just because you're young. It's coming. It's down the line. The feeling that your kindness runs out and you want to give up. Forgiveness is a challenge. It's insanely powerful if we can do it. It's so good for us. It's so good for the world. It's so necessary. But it's almost impossible. In fact, one of the things I would say to us, if we actually live like that, or if we encounter somebody who's so forgiving and think of some news headlines, it's actually an offense. I watched a sermon on this, so I can't take the credit for this anecdote, but it's an analogy, it's a story rather, about Remembrance Day, so I thought, I've got to share this story, it's so important. So 38 years ago today, at a remembrance service, maybe you'll be familiar with this story if anyone goes back like 50 years, in Xscape. Does anyone remember the story that happened on Remembrance Day in Xscape 38 years ago, something like that? The IRA, they were having a remembrance service in the square, so all the dignitaries, everyone's gathered around, all the peacekeepers gathered around, and the IRA set some bombs off. And there was a fella called George Wilson, and if you Google George Wilson, or if you search him up on Wikipedia, that kind of thing, you can find out all the information about him and all the interviews. This story went big. So him and his daughter suffered under this terrorist attack. The buildings collapsed, and him and his daughter were submerged under a building together. And they pulled them both out. But as is harrowingly often the case, he survived. And try and put yourself in his shoes if you've got kids. If you can imagine this, his daughter died. And a few days after this horrible thing happened, BBC are always around. The BBC did an interview, and so he gave the interview 2 days after he'd lost his daughter in this harrowing moment. And this is what he said. I would like to have had them up, but you can Google them or search for them afterwards. They're all out there. These words. They went huge because of what he said in this moment. 2 days after he lost his daughter in really harrowing circumstances, he stood in front of the crowds that gathered, and he said, "Her last words to me were, 'I love you, Daddy,'" if you can imagine that. But then he goes on to say, "To those who killed her," and this is what grabbed everybody's attention, "I bear no ill will, no grudge, no bitter talk. No grudge, bitter talk will not bring her back. I will pray tonight and every night that God will forgive them." Incredible. And then this interview it was spread all over the world. People couldn't get their heads around it. And it's our issue with forgiveness. It's insanely powerful. There's lots of book about the Troubles, but one book by a guy called William Ury is called We Fought, Why We Fight and How We Stop. And he says this about this moment and this interview. In 25 years of violence, no words have had such a powerful emotional impact on the conflict. Forgiveness. Absolutely impossible. Many, many people will have watched that and found it completely offensive. And at the same time, in it is great power. In it is maybe the only hope for some of our struggles. Why do we have such a struggle with forgiveness? I think one of the reasons might be, and this is again just something for us to think about, is because we reason a bit like Jonah. We have some of the Jonah logic in our system. See what he says in verse number 2. I knew you were nice. I knew that they'd get off with it. That's why I legged it to Tarshish. Now just break down what he's saying to us there. See what his motives and his choices are shaped around. His choices were shaped around the graciousness of God, but also what other people get away with. What shaped him was what other people get away with. It's amazing, I think, how often the decisions that we make in life, and I say we, I mean me, amazing how often the decisions I make in my life are based around what I see other people getting away with. They've got away with that, they've got that, they've got that. They're doing that and getting away with it, and I'm moved by it. My heart's revealed by it. I'm not always moved by what's right and what's true. And I think maybe you could say that about society on one level. So often in life, we're moved by what other people are getting away with. Jonah flees from God in this moment because he sees what other people are getting away with. Part of the wisdom of the Bible story is not to live a life based on what other people get away with, but what's true, what you have learned to be true. Justice, this thing that we question and wonder and find ourselves stuck between so often, and would query some people like Nineveh getting away with it. What's true? The Bible says justice and mercy have got to come together. We might ache for justice, but we need mercy. It's got to come together, and it's got to come for everyone. And it reshapes the way that we look at the world. Part of the wisdom of the Bible story is not to live a life based on what others get away with, but what you are given. Part of the wisdom of the Bible story is not to look at what others get away with, but what you yourself have been given. And what I'm talking about in this moment is forgiveness. You didn't go out and get forgiveness. One of the beautiful Bible messages is that forgiveness is a gift. Forgiveness is something that is given. It's forgiveness. It's gone before you. It's at the start of you. You just pick it up. Jesus says something incredible about forgiveness. He says, those who are forgiven much, love much. If you really know the extent of your forgiveness, if you can see yourself as part of the story of humanity, somebody who needs help in the big picture, if you actually clock that and you realize that you need forgiveness and that you've been given forgiveness, then that's going to be a catalyst for you for the rest of your life, if that's really, really true. That's not all that's going on with Jonah, though. It's not just that the baddies are getting away with it, and this is the last point, so we're nearly done. Pizza. I feel like I can sense a good pizza. I genuinely, sometimes I'll come home from work and I'll come in and say, is there pizza? And people will say no, and I'll say, but I believe that it's coming. I really think it's on its way. But hold on, last point. That's not all that's going on with Jonah. It's not just that the baddies get away with it. It's that what he holds dearest has come to light. The thing that he actually thinks will save him, the thing that he's actually got all his hope in, has come to light. And what he spotted, Jonah, in his tears, is that it's not secure at all. Jonah, and you won't know this if you've just come in for the first time tonight, or if you've not been every week. One of the things that we've sort of suggested about Jonah, he's a bit of a patriot. You might even say he's a nationalist. You maybe would even stretch to the fact, and part of me is just putting this into the conversation to get you interested. You might even say he's a bit xenophobic. And maybe that would be inevitable. He's come from Israel, who at this point, Jesus would say about their leaders, they've got quite a lofty sense of themselves. So make no wonder he's thinking like that. And also, and probably primarily, up the road, as we've been thinking about these Ninevites, up the road was the Assyrian Empire, the biggest, nastiest empire around, who, as Joe mentioned last week, would fight just because of the season that was coming round. They would go out and fight just because it was March. They would just go out and fight just to stretch their legs. They were a constant threat to Israel. They were the bully boys of that region. Every region's got its bully boys, hasn't it? And now, and this is the news that's hit Jonah in this moment, because of God's kindness, you know what's happened in the story? Everyone's turned back to God and he's forgiven them. And he's relented on his judgment. Not only were they not going to get wiped out, and so they'd stay this military superpower, this constant threat, they were also, and this is the bit that I think really crushed Jonah, not only were they still there as a military threat, but they were also now, because they'd turned back to God in a way that Israel hadn't, they were now morally superior as well. And Jonah is in pieces about this. I think that's what's got him crying. That's what's got him on his knees. We see his heart borne out in this moment, and it's not for God. It's not for God because everything for God has gone amazingly well, and he's still crying. What he treasures most, what he identifies most in the world with, what he puts all of his hope in, is the borders of his country, is his own security, its status and moral superiority. And he's seen how vulnerable that is, and he wants to give up, and he wants to die. The story at this point, I think, asks us to think about what it is that really saves us. What it is that we've really, and I mean us in the room, what it is that would really save us, what would really get us through. There Jonah is. He's this famous missionary. He's a preacher, he's a Hebrew, he's a prophet. And this should be an affirming moment for him. It should be like a celebratory moment. Everything's gone right, and yet his world is falling apart because of where his hope is. The thing that he has put all of his hope in is so vulnerable, and he's just realizing that even with God, God has taken him to this place where he's perhaps seen that for the first time. What I would say to you is, here we are, moral people, in the building, maybe even witnessing for Christ, and yet the story gets us to think. Like Jonah, there might be a moment down the line when we realize what we've put our hope in, and I want us to think about this, what we think will really save us, maybe our health, maybe our security, maybe our popularity, won't stand up to the job when push comes to shove. This is what the story gets us to think about. There is a moment down the line when what you really, really put your hope in, you've maybe been coming here for years and years, you've maybe been around the Christian story for years and years, and the story makes us pause over that moment, and it says, what on earth is it that you think when push comes to shove will really save you? And it says you may yet find yourself in a moment where you've been around this story for years and years and years and years, and you get to the point and actually you realize that the thing that really saves you is just being well or having your kids around or being popular. And the Bible story gets us to think, if that's the case, then that will disintegrate before your very eyes. If it's anything, this is what the Bible would suggest. If it's anything other than the loving, mighty arms of God who can sustain us through all troubles and forever, then it'll come undone. I love the emphasis of the story. I think it's really, really interesting, the emphasis of the story of Jonah. There's hundreds of thousands of people in Nineveh being saved, and yet that's not where the weight of the narrative is in this story. See where the weight of the narrative is? It's not on the hundreds of thousands of people that's been saved. It's on the one person, Jonah, who you'd think was saved, having to take a look at himself again to make sure just exactly what it is that he's putting his hope in. What is it that you put all of your hope in? We've seen a baptism today. What is going on in the baptism? Holly said at the start that it is a demonstration of an inner change. What is that demonstration about? This is the end of the sermon. I just want to run through some of this. It's not that Mitch and Kristen have got it all together. It's not that they know all of the answers. You're not going to go up to Mitch after this and say, just talk to me about the book of Deuteronomy, Mitch. He's going to say, don't think I know that. Maybe he'll throw me. It's not that they've got all the answers together. But it is that they've seen, and you heard this in their testimony, it is that they've seen how fragile and empty some of the things that they've treasured before are. Mitch made that really clear. He's just about, sounds like, tried everything. And he would say of it, no, I saw it disintegrate in front of my eyes, and I've seen something that I can treasure better that's going to last. That's what baptism says. It's not that Mitch and Kristen are able to keep all the commandments and have reached some sort of moral, lofty high ground. I think they're pretty awesome people, but they're not going to blow us all away with their holiness. Maybe they will. It's that they've realized, because I think this is what the pattern of the Bible is, it's not that they've realized that they're good or that they're better than anybody else. It's actually that they've realized that they're just the same as everybody else. They're in the same need of grace as everybody else. It's just that they're ready to receive it. And so when they live in grace, they won't look judgingly at anyone else of higher standing, and they won't look more loftily on themselves. It's not that Mitch and Grace won't need security. They're going to need security. They're going to need shelter. They're going to need stuff. It's just that they've found a better place to find their security. It's not that you won't see the boundary lines that divide us all. It's that you've got a security and an identity that transcends all those boundary lines. It's not either that you won't have your head in your hands some of the time. You'll still find yourself like Jonah with your head in your hands. But what it does mean is that it's more than just you who'll be picking your head up. It's a demonstration, but it's not a show. It's a demonstration, as Holly said, of an inner change. It's a demonstration of something real inside that can save. If that's something that just presses on your heart in this moment, I'd beg you just to consider it and think about that.